Hello, everybody. A different setting today. I decided to go outside where it's quieter, hopefully, and you can hear the birds chirping if you listen carefully. Today I'm reading chapter 4 of Across 5 Aprils. Twice during the month of February in 1862, the bells rang in every city and town throughout the North, and the name Ulysses S. Grant first became familiar to Jethro. The first real victory for the North had come with the fall of Fort Henry, down in Tennessee, just a few miles south of the Kentucky line. "God bless Grant!" people shouted over and over in a rising chant the day Jethro went to Newton with his father after the news of Fort Henry. Guns were fired, and people hugged one another in the streets. There was something to make them proud, something to give them hope after the despairing stories of Bull Run and Ball's Bluff and Wilson's Creek. 2 weeks later came the news that Fort Donelson had also fallen to General Grant. Then people really went wild with joy. "God bless old U.S. Grant," they shrieked. "Bless old unconditional surrender Grant." They laughed and cried, and nearly everybody thought that the war would be over in a matter of weeks. "What do you think, Pa?" Jenny asked eagerly a few days later as she put down the paper she had been reading aloud to the family. "Do you think it's about over?" Matt's face was grim. "With the Army of the Potomac doing nothing?" he asked. "Maybe my wits ain't good. Maybe I ain't got the sense to grasp what it is they're doing, but I can't see the end in sight. That general in the papers had us believing the papers had us believing was so fine. Brilliant, they called him. What does he plan? What's the matter with him?" "General McClellan has had typhoid fever, Pa. You know how weak that left Shad. We mustn't judge him too harsh." Matt nodded. "Maybe I misjudged the man, Jenny. God knows I hope that one of these days you can say that your Pa was wrong about General McClellan." He reached for the week-old paper and read again the letter that was the great tonic and stimulant of the day. Now here's the letter. "Headquarters Army in the Field, Camp near Fort Donelson, February 16th. General S.B. Buckner, Confederate Army. Sir, yours of this date proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle the terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose you move immediately upon your works. I am, sir, very respectfully, your servant, U.S. Grant, Brigadier General." Matt read farther down the page. "It says here that this General Buckner and Grant was comrades at West Point," he remarked, without lifting his eyes from the paper. "Yes," Jethro heard his mother say softly to herself, "and my Bill and John was even closer than that." They were worried about Tom and Eb. It was likely that the two boys were with Grant's army. The fighting, especially at Donelson, had been bitter. Some of the details of the battle neither Matt nor Jenny had read aloud to Ellen. Finally, one day, Ed Turner brought them a letter from Tom. Ed looked pinched with cold after his long drive, but he wouldn't stop for coffee. "Family needs to be alone when one of these letters comes," he said in answer to Ellen's invitation. "I'd be pleased if you let me know what the boy has to say later on when Matt has the time to drop over." Jenny had gone with her father to see about some stock, and Jethro was alone in the cabin with his mother. When Ed Turner was gone, she handed the letter to Jethro. "My hands is shaking, son," she said. They were, indeed, but both she and the boy knew that the real reason she was forced to hand the letter over was the fact that she could not read. The envelope was crumpled and stained, the letter written in pencil in a round, childish hand. It was probably among the first 3 or 4 letters that young Tom had ever written. Here's his letter. "Dear folks, I take pencil in hand to let you know that Eb and me is all right. I expect you know by now how we took Fort Henry down here. Maybe I oughtn't say we took it, because it was the ironclads that done it. Old Admiral Foote had what it took, and he give the Rebs a dressing down, but some of his ironclads got hit hard. A boy I know was on the Essex, and he was burned so bad he died when that boat got knocked out of the fight. Us boys didn't do much fighting at Fort Henry, but at Donelson I can tell you we made up for it. We had done a foolish thing on our way to Donelson, and I will write you about it. When we was marching toward the fort, the weather was like a hot April day back home. We was feeling set up about Fort Henry, and when some of the boys got tired of carrying heavy blanket rolls, they just up and throwed 'em away. Then more and more of us acted like crazy fools, and we throwed away heavy coats and things that make our loads a little lighter. As soon as we got to Donelson, the weather turned cold as Billy sideways, and some of the boys that was sick or bad hurt, they froze to death in the snow. Things was awful bad with so many killed and others froze. I felt sick when I looked at them, and so I am not so proud about Donelson as maybe I ought to be. I missed your good cooking, Ma. You tell Jeff that being a soldier ain't so much. Yours truly, Tom. Jethro noticed that his mother's face was strangely twisted when he looked up from the letter. There was a look about her as if sorrow had been frozen in her face, a look he had not seen there before, not even on the day when he had come home from Walnut Hill to tell her that Bill had left. She stared at Jethro for a time without saying a word. Then she got up and went into the pantry, closing the door behind her. Jethro sat quietly beside the fireplace. There was no sound in the cabin except the crackling of the fire, and there was no feeling inside him except a great loneliness. He picked up Tom's letter and read it again. Then he smoothed it carefully and returned it to the envelope. It seemed strange that this scrap of paper had actually come from a battlefield, that Tom's big hand had actually touched it. He tried to imagine what the ironclads looked like and how they had taken Fort Henry, how the guns must have roared in Donelson. Whatever in the world had possessed Tom and the other soldiers when they threw away their good winter coats and blankets. The pantry door opened after a while, and his mother came back into the kitchen. "Your ma's no company for you this afternoon, son." "That's no matter, Ma." "Maybe it would be good for you to go down and visit Shad for a while," she suggested after a pause. "You need a mite of change." He turned to her eagerly. "Could I, Ma?" he asked, half in disbelief that he had understood her. "I want him to read Tom's letter," she said, taking up the envelope. "Maybe after Pa and Jenny has seen it, you could take it to Shad." Sure, Ma. I'd be proud to do it for you." Ellen smiled wanly at his eagerness. "It's terrible cold, but I reckon you could stay the night with him if he's a mind to ask you. Then you'd have only one way to walk." "Oh, you're doing me a real big favor, Miss Creighton." "I'll allow it be, Jeff. Well, you and Shad have a good visit tonight. Ask him to come here for supper tomorrow. Him and little Jenny ain't got many more evenings to be together." The prospect of a visit with Shadrach changed the color of the world around Jeff, and he rushed to get his chores done early. He stacked a high pile of wood outside the kitchen where it could be reached quickly during the night. Out in the barn, he threw hay down from the loft and carried buckets of corn from the crib in preparation for the evening feeding of the stock. He was still working when Jenny came out to find him shortly after she and her father returned from their work. He noticed that her eyes were heavy with tears. "You read Tom's letter?" he asked. She sat down on a mound of hay, and the tears started again. Jethro stood beside her without speaking. After a while, she looked up at him. "Ma says you're going to go up to Shad's tonight." "Ma's having him here for supper tomorrow's night, so you and him can talk some," he said, recognizing the envy in her look. "Ma understands. She'd let me marry Shad before he leaves, but Pa won't. He talked to me about it this afternoon. It was the same old story. "You're too young to be married, Jenny. You're just a little girl." "Oh, Jeff, it's horrible to be so young. Why does there have to be a war to take Shad away from me before I'm of an age that Pa thinks is old enough for marrying?" Jethro was sympathetic and terribly uncomfortable. He shifted from one foot to the other and touched her shoulder timidly. She put her hand over his for an instant and then got to her feet. "I reckon I got precious little right to be crying over my troubles." He knew she was thinking of Tom, away somewhere in Kentucky or Tennessee with Grant's army. They didn't speak again until they were nearly up to the kitchen door. "I'll help you get bundled up for your trip," she said then, and added hurriedly, "Remember to tell me everything he says, Jeff. Will you do that for me?" "I sure will," he answered soberly. There was a time when he would have teased her, but not that evening. There was no time for light-hearted teasing about Shadrach Yale now that the winter term of school was over. Inside the house, she helped him pull on 2 pairs of heavy knitted socks, which helped fill out the pair of Tom's old shoes he was wearing. And she buttoned a heavy sheepskin coat around him, tying the collar up around his ears with her own red woolen scarf. Ellen drew a flat loaf of white bread from the ashes of the fireplace and wrapped it in a clean cloth. "This will keep your hands warm for a part of the way, at least. It ain't much of a gift to carry, but maybe the 2 of you will relish a little change from cornbread." He was patient. He knew that after a while they would let him go. There might be another adjustment of his collar, another gift for Shad, more admonitions about his company manners, but finally they would let him go. And they did, finally. He had to have his coat unbuttoned at the last minute and Tom's letter pinned securely inside his shirt, but after that there seemed to be no other reason for detaining him. Nothing to do but stand at the window watching as he plunged out into the cold late afternoon for his visit. The deep ruts in the road were frozen and glazed with ice. The wind had a clean sweep across the prairies, a sweep that sometimes seemed to carry Jethro before it. Tears froze on his cheeks, and the cold pounded against his forehead as he trudged along, weighted by the heavy, oversized shoes and the many layers of clothing. It was bitter, but not beyond the ordinary. Suffering at the mercy of the elements was accepted by Jethro as being quite as natural as the hunger for green vegetables and fresh fruit that was always with him during the winter. When one found comfort, he was grateful, but he was never such a fool as to expect a great deal of it. The hardships one endured had a purpose. His mother had been careful to make him aware of that. The schoolhouse, with the teacher's log room adjoining it, stood almost a mile from the Creighton cabin. It had been customary in years past for the schoolmaster to room and board with first one family and then another throughout the district. But young Yale had protested against the lack of privacy, and Matthew Creighton had been sympathetic. "A man has the right to the dignity of his own fireside after a day's work," he said, and he had allowed his sons and Shadrach to cut down trees from his own land for the annex. Shadrach Yale put down an armful of wood when he saw his guest approaching and came out to the road to meet him. "You look half frozen, Jeff," he said, taking the boy's hand, ran with him up to the log annex. "Come on inside and I'll have you thawed out in a minute or 2. Shadrach's long, narrow room was cheerful and attractive in spite of its roughness. A bright red and gold paisley cloth covered his homemade table and fell in full folds almost to the floor. There were a few braided rugs of warmly colored woolens scattered about, and on the mantel of the fireplace were candlesticks of heavy brass worn to a smooth satin finish. Opposite the fireplace were shelves made of logs split in half and nailed against the wall to hold the books that Shadrach had brought with him from college. A guitar hung on the wall at the south end of the room, and at that end, too, there was a wide bed made up with several comforters which Ellen had loaned him from her own store of bedding. A cupboard of heavy walnut, put together with wooden pegs, stood near the fireplace and held dishes, food, and cooking utensils. To Jethro, the room seemed perfect, as beautiful as any man had a right to expect. Shadrach helped him out of the sheepskin coat and put him in the armchair in front of the fireplace, where the flame struck at the great log and shot up in hot tongues now and then, as the fat from a roasting chicken dripped onto the fire. The warmth, the smell of food, and wood smoke overpowered Jethro for a while, and he would have sat silent, drinking in content, as if his obligations as a guest had not demanded more of him. "Going to spend the night with me, Jeff?" Shadrach asked, removing the boy's heavy shoes and chafing his feet with cheerful vigor. "Ma allowed I could if you was a mind to ask me." "I think she knew pretty well that I'd be of a mind to ask you." "She sent that loaf of white bread for our supper. It's fresh out of the ashes." "Good. I'm glad now that I had the sense to start a chicken roasting. Fresh bread and chicken should make a pretty good meal for a couple hungry bachelors like us, eh?" Jethro flushed with pleasure. Shad was like that. He was different. He had book learning and was almost 21. Still, he could make a 10-year-old schoolboy feel proud as a man. "How's Jenny?" Shadrach asked after a time. "She was crying a little. Pa's been talking to her about being too young for marrying me." "I know." It was the schoolmaster's turn to flush, and he looked stern, as he did sometimes in the classroom. "Ma would let her get married to you, Shad, but sometimes Pa can be so good, and then again, he can be awful strict." Shadrach stared gloomily at Jethro's feet, which he still held in his hands. "I respect him so much," he said after a while, "and I owe him so much. But I think he's overshooting the mark when he sets himself up as knowing exactly what is right or wrong for two other people. I think he's being tyrannical and—" He stopped himself abruptly. Jethro felt a twinge of loyalty for his father in the face of Shadrach's obvious anger. "Of course, Jenny is real young, Shad," he said, with the gravity of a small parson. Shadrach raised a black eyebrow. "Thou too, Brutus?" he asked, grinning a little sourly. Jethro did not understand the allusion, and Shadrach seemed to be in no mood for explanations. "There wouldn't be any question about it if it weren't for this war," he said, after a moment with his own thoughts. "I'd be willing to wait years for Jenny, but when I think of leaving her, maybe for a long time, I guess panic hits me a little." "When do you go, Shad?" "Next week. John and I. He'll go as far as Chicago with me. I'll go back to Philadelphia." "It seems like I can't face up to your going." "I'm not eager for it either, Jeth. Not by a long way. I've got a lot of plans for the next 40 or 50 years of my life, and being a soldier is not part of any single one of them." "Do you have to do it then?" "I guess I do. There's been a long chain of events leading up to this time. The dreams of men in my generation are as insignificant as that." He snapped his fingers sharply. "And we were foolish enough to reach manhood just when the long fizzling turned into an explosion. Maybe it will be over soon. I know Pa don't think so, but people in Newton was saying it would, and Jenny even read it in the paper." "What is that saying of your mother's about hope making a fool out of reason? We finally, mind you, have a victory at Forts Henry and Donelson. Then, hooray, the end of war is in sight for the optimist." "I'm afraid not, Jeff." The mentions of Fort Henry and Donelson made Jethro remember the letter. He hastily unpinned it from the inside of his shirt and gave it to Shadrach. "I forget this. It's from Tom. Ma wanted you to read it." Shadrach took the letter eagerly and held it so that it was lighted by fire as he read it. When he had finished, he had folded it slowly and looked into the flames. Jethro sat quietly watching his teacher's sober face. He thought of the boys frozen under the snow at Donelson. He remembered that he had not loved Tom as he had Bill and Shadrach. And suddenly, the warm, firelit room, the smell of food, the shelves of books, all wakened a feeling of guilt in his mind. He wondered if Tom had a coat and blanket. He thought of the bitter cold outside and shuddered involuntarily. Shadrach looked up at him. Still cold, Jeth? Nothing to speak of. You were thinking of the letter. I guess so. Shadrach shook his head. It's all a brutal business. There are going to be a lot of letters. Worse than this one. If this victory wasn't so much, Shad, why was people in Newton yelling so and saying, God bless Grant? It was an important victory, Jeth. Don't misunderstand me. Look, I'm going to show you something. Shadrach got to his feet and brought a pencil and piece of rough paper from the bookshelves. He drew the paisley-covered table up closer to the fire and motioned Jethro to join him beside it. Come here. We'll have a little lesson together. He was sketching rapidly. First the outline of a block of states, then lines to represent rivers and railroads and small squares for towns. His eyes began to shine with interest in his project as he worked. Now, this is the Confederate line, Jeth, beginning over here in eastern Kentucky. Shadrach studied his sketch and added a row of X's to represent the Confederates. Here, it comes across the bluegrass country. Then it crosses the Mississippi about here, and on it stretches across Missouri and on over into Indian Territory, a line of several hundred miles long. Now, all of this is under the command of a Confederate general named Albert Sidney Johnston. You've heard of him, maybe? I think I've heard Pod speak the name. Jethro was seeing in his mind's eye gray-clad men standing side by side, forming a single line across miles of fields, hills, and rivers. Grim, forbidding men, except for one familiar face. He wondered if Bill could feel comfortable in that long gray line of strangers. Then he pulled himself back into Shadrach's running explanation, which accompanied his sketching. Here are two rivers, the Tennessee and the Cumberland. See how they run side by side and only a few miles apart as they come up toward the Ohio? And notice that they are crossed by that Confederate line. Now, over here on the Ohio, our gunboats have been lying, some at the mouth of the Cumberland, some at the mouth of the Tennessee, a threat to this Confederate line, you see. Jethro shook his head. What if they did threaten it? Gunboats couldn't lick that long line of Rebs stretching across the map, could they? No, but look what they could do. What, in fact, they've already done. Notice how the Cumberland dips down into Tennessee and flows past these towns, Clarksville here and Nashville there. It's from these towns that the Confederates have been getting their supplies. This line can't move far or fight our armies if it doesn't have food, guns, ammunition. These things have been coming up the river, and this, Shadrach made a small square on the line representing the Cumberland and labeled it Donelson. This is the fort that the Confederates thought would be enough to keep our gunboats from controlling their supply line. And was it the same on the other river? In a way. See, this line represents a railroad. It comes up here from Memphis and crosses the Tennessee just below Fort Henry. Supplies have been coming up here by rail, probably every day. No doubt soldiers, too, as reinforcements for Johnson. Now, do you see why Grant and Admiral Foote struck at these forts? Yes, I see it now. Jethro felt a great satisfaction, which came from his new understanding. He studied the map thoughtfully. That was a wonderful thing Tom helped to do, wasn't it, Shad? Yes, it was, Jeth. We needed a victory. How we needed one. And Tom helped to give the Confederates a big setback. Things have been going their way all these months. But not now. This victory has clinched Kentucky to the Union side. That's a big thing in itself. But it ain't enough. Is that what you meant a while ago, Shad? Well, think for yourself, Jeth. Our armies in the West have a part of the Union's plans to carry out. Just one part. And let's see what it is. Have a look at old Mississippi here. If we can control this river, we can cut the Confederacy right in two. That's not saying we can win the war out here, but it would be a big step because any Confederate army west of the river would be just about powerless to do anything. Here in Kentucky, we're in control now. Johnston's men can't get supplies, so they have to withdraw or surrender. But down here, look how the Mississippi stretches through the states of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana, all enemy territory. And think how hard the fighting was at this little place on the map called Donelson. Does this make you want to throw up your hat and say it's all about over? The log in the fireplace fell apart, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, across the prairie, the shadows were almost black. Jethro and the young Yale were silent, a part of the great dread that spread in all directions over the land that night.